Hi, welcome to our discussion of Mice and Men. Great book. This is set during the Great Depression. So in 1929, the stock market crashed, and a lot of America's wealth turned out to be a little more than an illusion, so tied up in the stock market. And when that crashed, average people everywhere lost their life savings. Companies closed, people lost employment, and there was a lot of desperation to be had. And it drove a lot of workers into becoming itinerant workers, traveling farm workers. And our story is going to pick up with two of these men who are traveling farm workers during the Great Depression, this period where times are so very dark and so very difficult. So please do me a favor, and you need to be reading along while I read out loud to you. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm, too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank, under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp the lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, and with the spread pads of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come wearily from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore, there is an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by men who sat on it. Okay, it's an interesting opening. In some ways, it's very bucolic with these beautiful images of trees and mountains and gentle brooks. But on the other hand, you have these images of rabbits that are sitting up and are afraid. You have these images of boys that are kind of running away from school to play and to swim, which is beautiful. But the same place is being used by men who are jungling up near water. And what that means is that they're homeless and they're looking for a place that they can, that they can camp out without being driven away. The towns grew very afraid of these indigents and these itinerant workers, and very afraid of having these people turn into thieves that targeted them. And so oftentimes they would drive the homeless away. And so jungling up meant that you were looking for some place where you could hide and you could live off of a few cans of beans that you might have stolen from somewhere, or maybe that you worked in return for. But you can be somewhere that you're not going to get driven away by the local police. And so you have this very bucolic, gorgeous imagery, but then you have these little tiny moments of fear, of desperation, of reminder. So it's an interesting way to start, and we're definitely going to look at how the opening ties into how it ends. So, are we ready to keep going? Evening of a hot day started a little wind to moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills towards the top. On the sand banks, the rabbits sat as quietly as little gray sculptured stones. And then, from the direction of the state highway, came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noiselessly for cover. A stilted heron labored up into the air and pounded down the river. Pounding down. I mean, very guttural image and not a positive one, which is really at odds with this very beautiful scenery. For a moment, the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. So now we're starting. That was our exposition. And now we're going to introduce our characters. So we're continuing exposition, but we're going to get into the people end of it now. They had walked in single file down the path, and even in the open, one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trouser and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. So we're getting a working class image there. That idea of denim, it was fabric that was invented because it was so tough. The shapeless hats, so that you don't have any fashion going here. They have blanket bundles. And so what the homeless would do is they would put all of their possessions in the middle of a bundle and they would roll it up and then tie the ends so that all their possessions would stay safe. So you have an image here of working class and the fact that they have bundles, probably homeless working class. The first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes and wide, sloping shoulders. And he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweatband with his forefingers. Well, I'm wiping the hat. Sorry, not his forehead, his hat. And snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool, drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. Okay, we've very short period of time, we'd have two animal references in regards to the larger man, that he drags his feet the way a bear drags his claws. So he's not picking his feet up, so perhaps tiredness, but he's compared to a bear. And then when he's drinking, he's snorting into the water like a horse. So the question, when you start seeing a pattern, the question is always, well, why is that pattern there? Why is he compared to an animal? Don't know, but we know he is. So the small man has our first speaking role. "Lenny," he said sharply. "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much." Lenny continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lenny, you gonna be sick like you was last night?" Look at his very first words. "Lenny, for God's sake, don't do that. You're going to be sick like you were last night." Now, if we took out the fact that these are two full-grown men and we simply said, okay, you've got two characters and character A tells character B, don't do that. You're going to make yourself sick like you were last night. Well, what's the immediate characterization there? It's a very fatherly thing to say. It's a very parental thing to say. But yet these are described as two adult men. So oddness, yes. Start stacking up the oddness because it's your job to figure out what's going on. Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then he sat up on the bank and his hat dripped down on his blue coat and ran down his back. "That's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." He smiled happily. George unslung his bindle and dropped it gently on the bank. "I ain't sure it's good water," he said. "Looks kind of scummy." Lenny dabbed his big paw, his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. "Look, George, look what I done." Okay, time out. We have enough hints. Okay, we know that George says that water that's not moving is often scummy and dangerous. True. So we know that he has an element of common sense and knows how to take care of himself. Lenny, the large man, we see he's walking, dragging his feet like a bear drags his paws. We know that when he goes to drink, he doesn't scoop water up. He sticks his whole head in. We know that when he is at the water, he hits the water with his hand. And when the water rings go out, he's delighted by it. He's kind of like, look what I did. Okay. If you have little brothers or sisters, at what age do they sit in a bathtub and hit the water and amuse themselves by looking at water rings go out? Does a 7-year-old think that's amusing, or would a 7-year-old go, whatever? Yeah, which means Lenny is younger than 7. Lenny's probably younger than 5. So we're talking somebody who has a mental age like 3, 4, maybe 5. But yet he's described in terms of a bear and a horse. Steinbeck is very quickly addressing one of the many inequalities that you have in the 1930s. African American communities and Hispanic communities were hit much harder by the Depression because whites, who held most of the jobs and who held much of the power in the 1930s, when they had limited resources and had to lay people off, they got rid of minorities first. And in other books, Steinbeck certainly addresses a lot of these ethnic problems and the racism that's inherent with them. And we are going to see some of that here. But there is another group that really got the short end in the 1930s, and that is the disabled. Lenny is mentally disabled. And so when he's following George because he looks up to George. So there's some sort of relationship here. But I will tell you, in the 1930s, the more common reaction to having someone who's mentally disabled would be to put them as a state facility. In a state facility, very often they would have been restrained, sometimes chained to a wall, sometimes locked in a room. And other than being fed 3 times a day and given water, they would have been largely ignored and considered sort of untreatable. And so whatever the relationship is here, George is choosing to stay with Lenny, despite the fact that his society says that people who are mentally disabled really have no place in society. And so Steinbeck is very quickly telling you that this is an odd relationship through that characterization. So I'm going to redo George's line since we know he's a little bit different. Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all. Do you see what a childish thing that is to do? And then he sat up on the bank, and his hat dripped down, and his blue coat and ran down his back. That's good, he said. You drink some, George. You take a good big drink. He smiled happily. George unslung his bindle and dropped it gently on the bank. I ain't sure it's good water, he said. Looks kind of scummy. Lenny dabbed his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so that the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. Look, George, look what I done. George knelt beside the pool and drank from his hand with quick scoops. Tastes all right, he admitted. Don't really seem to be running, though. You never ought to drink water when it ain't running, Lenny, he said hopelessly. You'd drink out of the gutter if you was thirsty. He threw a scoop of water onto his face and rubbed it about with his hand, under his chin and around the back of his neck. Then he replaced his hat, pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees and embraced them. Lenny, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. So imitating George exactly. So now we're seeing more of that relationship. It's either a paternal relationship or a brotherly relationship. But Lenny is definitely taking the role of the little brother or of the son, the one that's always kind of trying to copy that older male relative who's emulating him. George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. he said angrily. We could just as well have rode clear to the ranch, and that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about. Just a little stretch down the highway, he says. Just a little stretch. Goddamn near 4 miles. That's what it was. Didn't want to stop at the ranch gate. That's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wondering too damn good to stop in Soledad at all. Kicks us out and says just a little stretch down the road. Bet it was more than 4 miles. Damn hot day. That is our first big piece of characterization on George. So what's the first impression of him blowing up, cursing, getting angry at the fact that the bus driver made them walk? Well, yeah, a lot of people would be frustrated. And you might even say, okay, a lot of people would end up cursing. But what did we say Lenny's mental age was? Are a lot of people going to curse that much in front of somebody who's 3, 4, 5 years old? Yeah. Steinbeck's very good at creating very strong characters very quickly, but it means you can't skip past stuff. You got to really think about it and read slow. Lenny looked timidly over to him. Well, why is Lenny timid? Because George scared him. So, not a perfect relationship here. Lenny looked timidly over to him. George? Yeah, what you want? Where are we going, George? The little man jerked down the brim of his hat and scowled over at Lenny. So you forgot that already, did you? I gotta tell you again, do I? Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard. Oh, I forgot, Lenny said softly. Well, I tried not to forget. Honest to God, I did, George. Oh, dear. Are you feeling Lenny's fear? Oh my gosh, I screwed up. And George's reaction to Lenny's fear is, you're a crazy bastard. I would say we've already entered the rising action because I'm assuming that we already see that there's some conflict here that is going to have to get resolved one way or another. Okay, I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well spend all my time telling you things, and then you forget them, and I tell you again. Tried and tried, said Lenny, but it didn't do no good. Well, I remember about the rabbits, George. The hell with the rabbits. That's all you ever can remember's them rabbits. Okay, now you listen, and this time you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. You remember sitting in that gutter on Howard Street and watching that blackboard? Lenny's face broke out into a delighted smile. Why, sure, George, I remember that, but what'd we do then? I remember some girls come by, and you says, the hell with what I says. Are you getting a feeling that he might have said something inappropriate about the girls? Yeah. So he's going to cut him off. The hell with what I says. You remember about us going into Murray and Reddy's, and they give us work cards and bus tickets? Oh, sure, George. I remember that now. His hands went quickly into his side coat pockets. He said gently, George, I ain't got mine. I must have lost it. He looked down at the ground in despair. You never had none, you crazy bastard. I got both of them here. Think I'd let you carry your own work card? Lenny grinned with relief. I thought I put it in my side pocket. His hand went into the pocket again. George looked sharply at him. Would you take it out of that pocket? Well, ain't a thing in my pocket, Lenny said cleverly. No, there ain't. You got it in your hand. What you got in your hand? Hiding it. I ain't got nothing, George. Honest. Come on, give it here. Lenny held his closed hand away from George's direction. It's only a mouse, George. A mouse? A live mouse? Just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it, honest. I found it. I found it dead. Give it here, said George. Oh, leave me have it, George. Give it here. Lenny's closed hand slowly obeyed. George took the mouse and threw it across the pool to the other side among the brush. What you want of a dead mouse, anyways? I could pat it with my thumb while we walked along, said Lenny. Well, you ain't petting no mice while you walk with me. You remember where we're going now? Lenny looked startled, and then in embarrassment hid his face against his knees. I forgot again. Jesus Christ, George said resignedly. Well, look, we're going to work on a ranch, like the one we come from up north. Up north? In Weed? Oh, sure, I remember, in Weed. That ranch we're going to is right down there about a quarter mile. We're going to go in and see the boss. Now look, I'll give him the work tickets, but you ain't going to say a word. You just stand there and don't say nothing. If he finds out what a crazy bastard you are, we won't get no job. But if he sees you work before he hears you talk, we're set. You got that? Sure, George. Sure, I got it. Okay. Now, when we go in to see the boss, what you going to do? Lenny thought, oh, do you see how very disabled he is? He can't remember even from one moment to another. This is someone with profound disabilities. Lenny thought. His face grew tight with thought. I ain't gonna say nothing, just gonna stand there. Good boy, that's swell. You say that over 2-3 times, so you sure won't forget it. Lenny droned to himself softly. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. And that tells you how bad society was for the disabled. If he says one word, if he says one thing that makes it clear that he is mentally, really mentally incompetent to sort of care for himself, not only will he lose the job, George will as well, just because he's Lenny's caretaker. No one will want to have a disabled man anywhere near them, and that means they will drive not only Lenny away, but also George. So as rough as George is being, and he is being unforgivably rough with somebody who's mentally very young, but as rough as George is being, George is also taking care of Lenny. And that is something that would be very rare for the time period. And he understands the very real danger. And because this is the Great Depression, if they lose work, during the Great Depression, people starved to death. And so there's real danger here. There's prodigious danger here. And George understands that. And he understands the dangers in a way that Lenny simply is not built to. I ain't gonna say nothing. Okay, said George. And you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in Weed neither. Lenny looked puzzled. Like I done in Weed? Oh, so you forgot that, did you? Well, I ain't gonna remind you if you do it again. A light of understanding broke on Lenny's face. They run us out of Weed, he exploded triumphantly. Yay, he's happy he remembered something. Run us out, hell, said George disgustedly. We run, they was looking for us, but they didn't catch us. Lenny giggled happily. I didn't forget that, you bet. He was just happy he didn't forget something. They got run out of town by somebody because Lenny did something bad. But all he's happy about is he remembered, because George yells at him about forgetting things, so his happy place is remembering. George lay back on the sand and crossed his hands under his head, and Lenny imitated him, raising his head to see whether he was doing it right. God, you're a lot of trouble, said George. I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you on my tail. I could live so easy and maybe have a girl. For a moment, Lenny lay quiet, and then he said hopefully, We gonna work on a ranch, George. All right, you got that. But we're going to sleep here because I got a reason. The day was going fast now. Only the tops of the Gabilan Mountains flamed with the light of the sun that had gone from the valley. A water snake slipped along the pool, its head held up like a little periscope. The reeds jerked slightly in the current. Far off toward the highway, a man shouted something, and another man shouted back. The sycamore leaves rustled under a little wind that died immediately. George, why ain't we going on to the ranch and get some supper? They got supper at the ranch. George rolled on his side. No reason at all for you. I like it here. Tomorrow, we're going to go to work. I seen thrashing machines on the way down. That means we'll be bucking greenbacks, busting a gut. Tonight, I'm going to lay right here and look up. I like it. George knows that the minute they re-enter society, he's going to have to start navigating his way around the prejudices that these men will have towards Lenny. And so for one night, he wants to avoid society. So you're already seeing conflict between the two men, although it's hard for them to have true conflict because Lenny doesn't understand enough to sort of fight back. But you are seeing George's frustration. But that's your first hint that you're going to have a lot of society versus person. George is very frustrated with society and very frustrated with how they treat Lenny. But he knows that if he wants work, if he wants money, if he wants to be able to feed them, that he has to find a way to navigate this. But for one night, he just wants to avoid other people. He wants to lay under the trees. Lenny got up on his knees and looked down at George. Ain't we gonna have no supper? Sure we are, if you gather up some dead willow sticks. I got 3 cans of beans in my bindle. You get a fire ready. I'll give you a match when you can get the sticks together. Then we'll heat the beans and have supper. Lenny said, I like beans with ketchup. That's such a 3-year-old thing to say. I like beans with ketchup. Well, we ain't got no ketchup. You go get wood, and don't you fool around. It'll be dark before long. Lenny lumbered to his feet and disappeared in the brush. George lay where he was and whistled softly to himself. There were sounds of splashing down the river in the direction Lenny had taken. George stopped whistling and listened. Poor bastard, he said softly, and then went on whistling again. In a moment, Lenny came crashing back through the brush. He carried one small willow stick in his hand. George sat up. All right, he said brusquely, give me that mouse. But Lenny made an elaborate pantomime of innocence. What mouse, George? I ain't got no mouse. George held out his hand. Come on, give it to me. You ain't putting nothing over. Lenny hesitated, backed away, looked wildly at the brush line as though contemplated running for his freedom. George said coldly, You gonna give me that mouse or do I have to sock you? Talking about hitting him. Give you what, George? You know goddamn well what. I want that mouse. Lenny reluctantly reached into his pocket. His voice broke a little. I don't know why I can't keep it. It ain't nobody's mouse. I didn't steal it. I found it lying right beside the road. George's hand remained outstretched imperiously, slowly, like a terrier. Third animal reference. Slowly, like a terrier who doesn't want to bring a ball to its master, Lenny approached, drew back, approached again. George snapped his fingers sharply, and at the sound, Lenny laid the mouse in his hands. I wasn't doing nothing bad with it, George, just stroking it. George stood up and threw the mouse as far as he could into the darkening brush, and then he stepped to the pool and washed his hands. You crazy fool, don't you think I could see your feet was wet where you went across the river to get it? He heard Lenny's whimpering cry, and he wheeled about, blubbering like a baby. Jesus Christ, a big guy like you. Lenny's lip quivered, and tears started in his eyes. Aw, Lenny. George put his hand on Lenny's shoulder. I ain't taking it just for meanness. That mouse ain't fresh, Lenny. And besides, you broke it petting it. You get another mouse that's fresh, and I'll let you keep her a little while. Do you hear that father image? He knows that carrying a mouse, that's going to carry diseases, that this is dangerous. And yet the minute when his oversized Lenny starts with the quivering lip and the crying, he's like, oh crap. Okay, I'll buy you, just don't cry. I'll buy you something. So there is a lot of love in these lines. So despite the fact that George is a little short-tempered and maybe not the best caretaker for somebody with mental disabilities, he loves Lenny a lot. And the minute Lenny starts to cry, he kind of breaks a little, says, get another mouse. I'll let you keep it for a while until it starts to stink and rot. And Lenny sat down on the ground and hung his head dejectedly. Oh, I don't know where there is no other mouse. I remember a lady used to give 'em to me, ever one she got, but that lady ain't here. George scoffed. Lady, huh? Don't even remember who that lady was. That was your own Aunt Clara, and she stopped giving 'em to you. You always killed 'em. Lenny looked sadly up at him. They was so little, he said apologetically. I'd pet 'em, and pretty soon they bit my fingers, and I pinched their heads a little, and then they was dead because they was so little. I pinched their heads just a little, and I don't know why they died. They died because they were little. Pretty sure Lenny was crushing their skulls. But he doesn't get that. Oh, I wish we'd get rabbits pretty soon, George. They ain't so little. I don't know. Do you think rabbits are going to survive either? They are bigger. They're still a little breakable. They ain't so little. To hell with the rabbits, and you ain't to be trusted with no live mice. Your Aunt Clara gave you a rubber mouse, and you wouldn't have nothing to do with it. It wasn't no good to pet, said Lenny. The flame from the sunset lifted from the mountaintops, and dusk came into the valley, and a half-darkness came in among the willows and the sycamores. A big carp rose to the surface of the pool, gulped air, and then sank mysteriously into the dark water again, leaving widening rings on the water. Overhead, the leaves whisked again, and little puffs of willow cotton blew down and landed on the pool surface. Ooh. We have the snake that was swimming under the water with just the periscope head up. Now we've got a carp that comes up, gulps air, and then goes back and is under the water. So we're having these images of things being hidden under the surface, and not particularly subtle images. One of the nice things about Steinbeck is that when he does symbolism. It's like right there. You gonna get that wood? George demanded. There's plenty right up against the back of that sycamore, floodwater wood. Now you get it. Lenny went behind the tree and brought out a litter of dried leaves and twigs. He threw them in a heap on the old ash pile and went back for more and more. It was almost night now. A dove's wings whistled over the water. George walked to the fire pile and lighted the dried leaves. The flame cracked up among the twigs and fell to work. George undid his bindle and brought out 3 cans of beans. He stood them about the fire, close in against the blaze, but not quite touching the flame. There's enough beans for 4 men, George said. Lenny watched him from over the fire. He said patiently, well, I like 'em with ketchup. Well, we ain't got any, George exploded. Whatever we ain't got, that's what you want. God almighty, if I was alone, I could live so easy. I could go get a job and work and no trouble, no mess at all. And when the end of the month come, I could take my $50, go into town and get whatever I want. Why, I could stay at a cat house all night. I could eat any place I want, hotel or any place, and order any damn thing I could think of. And I could do all that every damn month. Get a gallon of whiskey, or sit in a pool room and play cards or shoot pool. Lenny knelt and looked over the fire at the angry George, and Lenny's face was drawn with terror. And what do I got? George went on furiously. I got you. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble. You do bad things and I got to get you out. His voice rose nearly to a shout. You crazy son of a bitch. You keep me in hot water all the time. He took on the elaborate manner of little girls when they are mimicking one another. Just wanted to feel the girl's dress. Just wanted to pet it like it was a mouse. Well, how the hell does she know you just wanted to feel her dress? She jerks back and you hold on like it was a mouse. She yells and we got to hide in an irrigation ditch all day with guys looking for us. And we got to sneak out in the dark and get out of the country all the time like that, all the time. I wished I could put you in a cage with about 1 million mice and let you have fun. His anger left him suddenly. He looked across the fire at Lenny's anguished face, and then he looked ashamedly at the flames. It was quite dark now, but the fire lighted the trunks of the trees and the curving branches overhead. Lenny crawled slowly and cautiously around the fire until he was close to George. He sat back on his heels. George turned the bean can so another side faced the fire. He pretended to be unaware of Lenny so close beside him. George? Very softly. No answer. George? What do you want? I was only fooling, George. I don't want no ketchup. I wouldn't eat no ketchup if it was right here beside me. If it was here, you could have some. But I wouldn't eat none, George. I'd leave it all for you. You could cover your beans with it, and I wouldn't touch none of it. George still stared morosely at the fire. When I think of the swell time I could have without you, I go nuts. I never get no peace. I'm going to leave you guys to read the rest of chapter 1 on your own. There's not that much left. I read most of it. But let's talk about that for a second. We are seeing the society versus person conflict with George. The first part of it is that he can't keep a job. And he says it's because Lenny is always doing things that gets in trouble. And the most recent thing in Weed was a girl had a pretty dress. Well, Lenny is mentally 3, 4, 5 years old. He sees something pretty. What do kids that age do? They grab it. And so Lenny reached out to grab the dress because he wanted to pet the dress. So maybe it was velvet, maybe it was silk. It was something that he thought was very pretty. And when she panicked and screamed, he held on tighter. It's a panic response. She thought he was trying to rape her. Now, mentally 3, 4, 5, very likely Lenny doesn't even have that capacity. But this is a society that has no understanding of mental disabilities. And so there's no way for George to explain that what they are looking at might be a fully muscled 6 foot tall man, but mentally he's still 3, 4, 5 years old. In modern society, he would be able to explain that to someone and say, wait, he's mentally disabled. Here's what's happening. Lenny, let the girl's dress go. But in this society, where there's no understanding of disability, their only option is to run. Now, keep in mind, George is free to leave at any time. But if he does, Lenny is completely helpless on his own. And because he chooses to stay with Lenny and to take responsibility for Lenny, that means that all of the discrimination that he normally would not have to face as a white man who has no disabilities, all of a sudden, all of that prejudice and all of that discrimination now belongs to him too. He's getting run out of town. He's losing the ability to keep a job. And he's frustrated. And that frustration is coming out in the one place where it's safe for it to come out. And that's at Lenny, which is unfair to Lenny because he does not understand. So look at what it is that George says that he wants out of life. And here's my question. He says that he wants to get a job and work with no trouble, that he wants to be one of these average ranch hands that works for a month and then gets enough money to go and to sit in a cat house, whorehouse, lovely, great morals, George, that could, sit in a cat house and buy a gallon of booze and do some partying and then go and work another month, and that would be his happy place. So the question is, what's keeping him from doing that? Because literally he could. So you finished chapter 1, and next week we'll talk about it.